Race, gender, social class, ethnicity. These are all factors that determine who we are and how we perceive the world. We all categorize ourselves based on who we are, so why are some punished?
Wave.
I've seen it.
What am I saying? We don't need to do this. We just need to write our names.
Just wave. Nick, wave.
We started by first asking Mr. Gabehart, a teacher in North Oldham High School that specializes in the 60s era, a time in which racial tensions spiked.
Mr. Gabehart,
Yes,
would you say that we have problems with diversity at North Oldham?
diversity issues, I think, exist everywhere, no doubt about it. And certainly North Oldham High School, like any other school anywhere, has issues with diversity. Essentially issues with just understanding people who are different. We often think of differences based on race as being diversity, but there's all kinds of diversity issues we deal with. One issue here at North Oldham High School, for example, is the issue of class. That we do not have a diverse makeup in our student body of people from different classes. Many of your classmates will never go west of the paddock without thinking they're going into the slums or something. It's kind of humorous, but understanding that people are different based on class can be a problem here at North Oldham High School. And oftentimes race and class overlap, if not integrate. That when we talk about people of race, for example, African Americans, and we're talking about poor people, they seem to be talking one and the same. And it certainly oftentimes when people are talking about poor people, it is a way of talking about race without sounding racial. So we certainly have issues of diversity here at North Oldham High School having to do with class and other ways. In other ways, we seem to be more open to issues of diversity in certain ethnic groups that are more represented here at this school.
Okay, thank you.
When evaluating the presence of racism in the United States, it is important to understand the historical tensions between ethnic groups. The most obvious example of this is slavery, where many African Americans were forced to provide labor to white landowners under the threat of violence. The practice of slavery officially ended with the adoption of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery or indentured servitude except as a punishment for crime. This exception allowed for Jim Crow laws to take hold in the states. When thinking about the advancement of social justice in the United States, it is common to think of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his method of nonviolent resistance. He fought against the existence of Jim Crow laws and demanded change and progress. The reenactment of the Selma March, led by Dr. MLK Jr., is represented in the award-winning film Selma.
You that build all other guns, you that build the dead plane, you that build the big bombs, just want you to know that I see through your mask. You that never done nothing but build.
One of these changes brought about by social justice was the end of segregation. One of the most notorious and controversial Supreme Court cases, Brown v. Board of Education, deemed the principle of separate but equal inherently unequal and unconstitutional. The end of legal segregation led to protests and discontent about integration. Many states refused to cooperate with this federal mandate, leading to increased racial and political tensions. This eventually resulted in integration in all regions and even the adoption of affirmative action programs.
Have you ever been discriminated against?
Yes.
Thank you. Have you ever been discriminated against?
Yes.
Thank you.
There.
Have you ever been discriminated against?
Yes, I have.
In what way?
Someone called me a cracker.
Have you ever been discriminated against?
No.
Thank you.
Have you been racially discriminated against?
Sort of. I'll take that as a yes.
He says sort of, yes. Have you been racially discriminated against?
Yeah.
Media exposure of racial difficulties have consistently brought the issue into light. This exposure includes films such as Get Out, which covers racism from an abstract perspective.
Where are those keys, Rose?
You know I can't give you the keys, right, babe?
Come on.
For many, the incarceration of blacks is merely because of a higher proportion of criminals. In reality, blacks make up only 15% of the population of drug users. In 2000, white youths aged 12 to 17 were over 33% more likely to sell drugs than black youths. Despite this, people still stand by the stereotype that most drug users and criminals are black. Mass incarceration refers to the unprecedented prison overcrowding that resulted from get tough on crime measures. The Reagan administration launched the war on drugs in the 1980s, which created harsh and racially disparate penalties for even minor drug offenses. Since this, the black population has been specifically targeted. The United States has the largest incarceration rate in the world. 716 people are imprisoned per 100,000 people in the population. This is compared to Australia's 130 and Germany's 79. The percentage of incarcerated males aged 20 to 24 by race are as shown, with 42% being black, 25% being Hispanic, 25% being white, and 8% being represented by other. The problem of mass incarceration is furthered by the lack of representation in government. The criminal justice system is heavily influenced by groups that profit from incarceration. Because so little minorities are represented in Congress, the problem has habitually been ignored. Maintaining the prison industrial complex has become an increasing concern in today's society, as many other factors of incarceration are ignored. Corporations such as Wells Fargo and the Bank of America have invested in prison privatization and ensure the profits keep going up. There are an estimated 1.2 million current prison inmates with mental illnesses and disabilities. Mental Health America, an organization focusing on the most prevalent causes of mental illnesses, found that the states with less access to mental health care have more adults who are in the criminal justice system. States has undergone a national project of overcriminalization. This has kept more than 2 million people behind bars at any given moment in time, and has successfully brought the U.S. incarceration rate far beyond that of any other nation in the world. The problem of mass incarceration is furthered by the lack of representation in government. The criminal justice. The likelihood of imprisonment for U.S. residents differ greatly by their demographics. White men have a 5% chance of incarceration, while black men have a 33% chance. Furthermore, white women have a 0.9% chance of imprisonment, while black women have a 6% chance. Over the last 90 years, the United States found that black people are more likely to be wrongfully convicted of crimes than white people. Blacks were found to be 7 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted of murder, 3.5 times more likely to be convicted of sexual assault, and 12 times more likely to be convicted of drug crimes.
Ellen, can you define recidivism for us?
No.
Recidivism is when someone has already been to prison and they reoffend and go back. Do you think race could play a role in recidivism?
Possibly, yeah.
Matt, can you define recidivism for us?
Recidivism is, I guess, people that are stuck in the justice system and they reoffend, I guess.
Do you think race might have anything to do with recidivism?
Technically, yeah. I think it has to do more with people of lower social class, and typically people of lower social classes are minorities, at least in the United States, and for that reason, I would say they're probably preyed upon and do more illegal activities.
Thank you. Sid, could you please define recidivism for us?
I have no clue.
Recidivism is when you've already been to prison and you go back for a second, third, or fourth time, or even more than that. Do you think race could play a role in recidivism?
Possibly. I'm not sure.
Zach, can you define recidivism for us?
I have no idea what that means.
Recidivism is when someone has already been incarcerated and they go back to prison for a second or third or even more times. Do you think race could play a role in recidivism?
Possibly to a small degree.
Nick, can you please define recidivism for us?
Recidivism is like people like going back to prison who've already been there.
Do you think race could play a role in recidivism?
I think that it could, just because, all the articles about police officers going for African American men and stuff.
Racial tensions have most clearly been reflected in the Black Lives Matter movement. This movement has grown in response to political brutality and growing media exposure. The prison industrial complex refers to a set of bureaucratic, political, and economic interests that encourage increased spending on imprisonment regardless of the actual need. This explains the pressure for the justice system to incarcerate so many.
We then decided to interview Dr. Sherry Dawson-Edwards, an associate professor in the Department of Justice Administration at the University of Louisville. Dr. Edwards has a PhD in public policy and administration and holds bachelor's degrees in sociology from Western Kentucky University and a master's degree in justice administration from the University of Louisville. Although we lost the audio of our interview, Dr. Dawson-Edwards' insights are still useful. We asked her 5 main questions. Dr. Dawson-Edwards gave a fairly straightforward answer to this question. The mistreatment of African Americans began, most obviously, with slavery. After slaves were granted freedoms in theory, many were prevented from being able to actually grow out of their situations. She gave an example. When Gunnar Myrdal published An American Dilemma in 1944, most blacks lived in the South and on the land as laborers and sharecroppers. Representation was still limited with the existence of literacy tests and other discriminatory measures that kept black votes out of American politics. Jim Crow laws kept black Americans from participating in many parts of society and furthered the divide between racial groups. Since the civil rights movement in the 1960s, opportunities have become almost exponentially more available, according to Dr. Dawson, although stereotypes about black people have still stayed consistent. Jim Crow laws have developed to the system of mass incarceration that has been used to keep black people in a lower social class. Dr. Dawson-Edwards went into her own personal concerns for her son, who despite relative privilege and resources is still seen as merely a black boy in the eyes of the law. Dr. Dawson quickly responded to this question with a definite yes. If you look at the statistics describing the actual proportion of the population participating in illegal activities and the proportion of black Americans who have been charged or incarcerated for these crimes, you see significantly different numbers. Again, she said, using incarceration is a way that the elite have been able to keep lower-class black Americans devoid of the opportunities commonly provided to every other group in society. The biggest problem with the prison industrial complex, according to Edwards, is the existence of the complex itself. This system involves government and private interest groups working together to decide upon policy measures and implementation. The problem with this is that the groups that have the most influence on policy are the ones that make the most money, and these groups are those that profit over incarceration. Corporations that are given contracts to provide any number of resources, including food, healthcare, and clothing, are those that are involved. These corporations, as well as those that profit off of prison labor, ensure that alternatives to incarceration are done away with. This, coupled with the encouragement of get tough on crime measures, have ensured that Black Americans will not be able to escape the cycle of criminal justice even for the smallest of offenses. Dr. Dawson Edwards describes the reform that she believes is needed to remedy the problem as one that provides resources to those that are at risk for criminal behavior. The most significant resource is education. Dawson believes that education should be at the center of every anti-crime measure. Study after study has shown that providing an education which increases the individual's ability to get a steady job and lifestyle lowers crime and recidivism rates. A more fundamental remedy to this problem would be to eliminate the system of racism itself, and in this way punish all criminals equally. Edwards stated that race is the biggest factor that impacts an individual's risk of being targeted. This is evidenced by police brutality and the role it plays in changing so many lives. While white children are taught to trust police officers, many Black children grow up with the fear of being targeted or even hurt by the same group of people. When asked if social class or race plays a bigger role, Dr. Dawson Edwards had an insightful comment. While you can change your social class, you can't change your race. No matter how wealthy or poor you are, you still deal with prejudice and discrimination.
Researchers found that inmates who participate in correctional education programs have 43% lower odds of returning to prison than those who do not. When looking at the numbers, mental health centers have proven to save money. In fact, for every dollar spent on educating inmates, the country actually saves $3 to $4 when comparing mental health care to traditional prison sentencing. This proves that not only is it an effective way of reducing prison sentencing, but it's also an investment for the future of America. Currently, mental health care centers have a very spot-on record, providing information stating that offenders who went through traditional courts had 1.8 times more charges and spent almost 5 times more days in jail for repeat offenses when compared to offenders who graduated from the mental health care centers after completing their terms of participation.